We are just 4 days away from the end of the most expensive election season in the history of the country, with more than $350 million spent on ballot measures in California alone. And voter registration in the state has hit an all-time high, with 18 million now on the rolls. Who are the new voters, and what are their interests and concerns? Plus, 1 million Giant fans faithful filled the streets to celebrate their team's World Series sweep. Coming up next. Hello, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on the news panel tonight, Josh Richmond, regional political reporter for the Bay Area News Group. Carla Marinucci, San Francisco Chronicle senior political editor. And Odette Keeley, New America Media anchor and executive producer. And in Sacramento, John Myers, KXTV News 10 political editor. Well, this campaign season has been marked by massive amounts of spending from outside groups. Yet with all of the money spent and all of the people who've paid attention, the race for president remains too close to call. And here in California, we're feeling the effect of an onslaught of political ads for candidates and ballot measures. Well, John, you've been reporting on a big ruling Wednesday on an $11 million political contribution to the groups opposing Proposition 30. Tell us what the judge decided.
Well, the judge decided, Belva, that that mysterious Arizona group needed to disclose its donors, or at least disclose them to the state's Fair Political Practices Commission. The group appealed. The disclosure is still tied up as we speak. The disclosure hasn't happened, and the state and the Attorney General and the Fair Political Practices Commission has asked the state Supreme Court to make the group give them the document so they can examine it to see whether they have to disclose the donors. Bottom line is all of this is happening right before the election. And whether we find those donors out remains to be seen. But it's $11 million, which is a lot of money until you kind of back up and look at the larger macro focus here. The Maplight Foundation, which tracks campaign money both in California and other parts of the country, came out with a number recently that they calculate $350 million on ballot measures alone this general election season in California. Remember, that doesn't include legislative, congressional, anything else. $350 million in ballot measures, certainly Prop 30, the governor's measure, Prop 32, this union paycheck protection measure, and Prop 37 in particular, and there are a few others, but Prop 37 about food labeling. Those plus Molly Munger's money on Prop 38, Tom Steyer on Prop 39. I could go on and on. It has been a huge campaign spending season.
Millionaire row, huh?
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, John, when you're talking about millionaire row, as Belva said, the Munger brother and sister team, I think, amazing how much money they've spent on their two measures. I mean, talk a little bit about this in terms of the billionaires who have weighed in, or the millionaires, and how that sort of shaped this whole election season here in California.
And you know, Carla, you and I know it's fascinating. I mean, the track record of wealthy people in California trying to get their way in politics is pretty bad. Governor Wesley, Governor Checky, and on. In other words, they never made it. But this is a very different group of wealthy people. These aren't people who are looking at elected office, right? They're looking at ballot measures. And so Molly Munger, the Pasadena civil rights attorney who has almost completely financed Prop 38, the K through 12 income tax increase that looks like it's going to fail on Election Day, and her brother, Charles Munger. They both got their money from their dad, who is Warren Buffett's business partner. Charlie Munger, who operates in Republican politics and has been financing this Prop 32 paycheck deduction measure, and apparently also financing the anti-Jerry Brown tax measure, though he apparently didn't think he was. That's another complicated story. And yet Tom Steyer, the hedge fund manager who has been financing Prop 39, I think only Prop 39 is the only one that looks safe at this point. And you got to wonder, I mean, what is it they want? Do they see a civic duty? Do they see a political future for them? Certainly Tom Steyer, people wonder what he's going to do in future politics. But Jerry Brown is a guy who has been vexed by the Munger family in this race, right? Because Molly Munger's Prop 38 could be drawing support away from him. and her brother Charlie Munger is financing the campaign apparently to kill his tax measure.
Didn't one of them just put some more money in this last week?
The brother, Charles Munger, put more money into this political action committee called the Small Business Action Committee. I'm not sure there are any small businesses involved in it. And that has been fueling this no on 30, yes on 32 mix. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of money. And honestly, I don't think any of us who watch California politics, the folks there in the studio in San Francisco or me, are surprised that this is where we're going. I mean, it is big money politics in California.
Well, John, I'm curious if any of that big money is going to try to address what may be a backlash with Latino voters with Prop 30 and the kind of feedback that California Latino voters have with Governor Jerry Brown. Polls are showing that there is significant support, even including Latinos, for Prop 30. But we've heard from radio journalists, radio hosts here in the San Francisco Bay Area that a lot of predominantly Democratic Latinos are very disappointed with the 3 vetoes that Jerry Brown did with immigrant bills like the Farm Workers' Rights Bill, Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, and the Trust Act.
Yeah. But would that really matter when you have schools that would lose an enormous amount of money, universities that would lose funding, so many people that are in the groups we're talking about who depend upon these state services?
There was something very impassioned, and I'm definitely going to let John address this question and how this may be resolved by Brown's group and himself. How impassioned Latino voters are about what it means for them to have taken that citizenship path, to have applied that right to vote, went out and vote, and to feel that what the governor has done is to take away that right.
Well, and you know, it's interesting because, I mean, at the same time, Jerry Brown moved forward on the California DREAM Act and on the issue of driver's licenses for those undocumented immigrants who qualify into the program that President Obama is moving forward. I think Jerry Brown probably sees this as the old canoe theory of politics that he's practiced before, about he leaned a little left, leaned a little right. I will tell you, I think that those vetoes and a lot of other decisions were all done with an eye toward a coalition for this election. We felt it in Sacramento all year long that the governor was making decisions that were trying to set him up with what he thought was the best constituency at the polls. Belva, you're exactly right. I think those voters have a choice to make about what issue they care most about when they have to mark that ballot on Tuesday. And I will say that if we've looked at the way that voter registration has increased over the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of those voters we think are young voters. And those young voters, as Mark DiCamillo at the Field Poll told me the other day, you know, those really are a more diverse group ethnically, more diverse financially than a lot of the other voters in California. Maybe that does include some of the groups, the Latino community as well. And I do think it's a great question. Where do those voters lie come Election Day?
Well, have any of you heard anything about the attitude of people about the amount of money coming into the state? Anybody at the table?
Well, I know on the presidential race, this has been a really interesting thing to watch, the amount of money from Silicon Valley. It now surpasses Hollywood and New York, which are 2, of course, huge Democratic fundraising fonts. And I think, you know, money is everywhere. And we've seen in the presidential race, the president come back here 12 times, picking up cash almost every month. This is
Mitt Romney's been here 9 times as well.
That's right.
It's, you know,
That's right.
And never done a single public event.
Right.
Has anybody done a real public event?
You know, the president early on did, and this shows the importance of Silicon Valley again, some town hall meetings at Facebook. He did one at LinkedIn. He has done a couple of events. Maybe there was that one at Solyndra that he doesn't want to remember now. But the fact is that there were very, very few public events. In the Bay Area, it was all about money, particularly money from Silicon Valley.
But in the old days, politicians would come and you could go to the fairgrounds and you could see them.
That's all gone.
That's all gone.
Over.
So the
That's
access to
The
these
access
candidates
has
by
changed.
the average voter has disappeared.
The average voter needed a minimum of $100 to get into any of these things,
Yeah.
certainly in the Bay Area.
And there are a lot in minority communities that are both on each spectrum, whether they are those donors, they are those hosts to these $12,000 a plate, or they're the common voters wanting to get access
In
and
fact,
not
in
being
the
able to do that.
presidential race, we saw something really unusual. President Obama having roundtable discussions, $40,000 a head with the API community. He did one. He did a couple with the tech community. I mean, these became very specific events. And Josh is right. The old days of candidates having free public events, at least in California, where we don't matter. If you've seen how many events they've done in Ohio in the last couple of days. We've been complete footnote to this presidential election.
But I wonder, Carla, you're watching the presidential race more than anything. I mean, when we're sitting here talking about this dynamic of what happens and do we have maybe a split of popular vote and electoral college, there's this interesting theory out there, isn't there, that, California may not matter electoral college-wise, but let's say California voters don't really care about voting for the president, which I don't think is going to happen, by the way. It would depress the popular vote in some way, and maybe we would have this split decision. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but at a certain point, he's got to care about us, right?
No, at a certain point, you're right, John. The fact is the popular vote in California, he's double digits ahead here. We know that. And, with the impact of Sandy, we really don't know how it's going to affect the popular vote in the East Coast.
Now, that's the storm.
And that is the storm, the hurricane. I mean, it could, New Jersey, you're talking about New York. I'm even hearing Ohio, there's some residual effects. I mean, this could be an issue. This is could be a cliffhanger this coming week.
We seem to be able to talk about most things, very little about issues in this whole election cycle, because there's been such a predominant of PACs and other groups contributing to races. Again, we feel the ping of money when it comes to the congressional races.
Absolutely, and Sacramento in particular has been an incredible hotbed of spending on congressional races, because there are actually 4 pretty well contested races that sort of fall within that media market. There's the 7th district, where Republican incumbent Dan Lundgren is in serious trouble as Democratic challenger Ami Bera takes a second bite at the apple, and that's considered a toss-up race. Jerry McNerney, Democratic incumbent, is the only Democratic incumbent who's considered to be a toss-up in California, that just got moved to that column yesterday by the Cook Political Report. He faces a 25-year-old Republican newcomer named Ricky Gill. And Jeff Denham.
In both those races, those are Indian American candidates as opponent, which could make them the first in Congress. I think that's an interesting.
And then there's a Latino challenger, Jose Hernandez, who's taking on Republican incumbent Jeff Denham of Modesto. Hernandez is a former NASA astronaut. He's gotten a lot of buzz about his candidacy. That's a toss-up as well. And then a little bit less of a toss-up is John Garamendi defending his Democratic seat against Colusa County Supervisor Kim Van. That's considered to be leaning in Garamendi's direction, but still competitive. So you got those 4 districts all clustered sort of in the Sacramento media market, and the spending from the national parties and from the super PACs and from those campaigns themselves has been ginormous.
And Josh, you know what's interesting about that, being here in this market and working at a television station here, I mean, first of all, I've seen all the ads, and I think our salespeople are pleased with that. Right. But having said that, when you look at the ads and you look at those campaigns, I mean, these have been campaigns fought on national issues. I mean, these have not been local air wars. I mean, we're not talking about, we are in some ways, we're talking a little bit about valley issues, water and things, but we're talking about Medicare, who's cutting Medicare, the infamous $700 and so many million dollars, the Romney plan, the Obamacare issues. I mean, it has become all of these national issues that those 4 races have focused on. They're almost they give us a bit of a slice of flavor of what we're hearing on the presidential level.
And Josh, we've heard all along Nancy Pelosi talk about the drive for 25. They need 25 seats to win back the House. She seems convinced, at least plays that part, that they're going to be able to do that.
Right.
Does that look possible?
She plays that part very well because it is her job to play that part. I don't think anybody thinks that the Democrats have a real shot at retaking the House in this election. I think the prevailing wisdom is they will gain seats, but they will not have enough to put Nancy Pelosi back in the Speaker's office. On the other hand, over in the Senate, where a lot of people had thought that the Democrats were vulnerable to losing the Senate, it now looks like they will retain control of the Senate, because the Republicans have faltered in states like Missouri and Indiana and Massachusetts and a few other places. And so we stand a very good chance, I think, of ending up with once the smoke is settled here, having the status quo of exactly the balance of power that we had before this entire election cycle. I think the possibility of a sea change is quickly fading.
And I think, the smoke, you mentioned the smoke being cleared. Yeah. We're not exactly sure when that might happen.
Oh, it's going to take a long time. I mean, more people in California are voting by mail than ever before, and a lot of them hold on to those ballots till the last minute. It could take weeks for county election workers to match all those signatures and tally all those votes. So close races could be a long time before we know how some of these are settled.
I'm going to go around and ask each of you about issues. Odette, you're here because there have been several polls for the first time that talk about the issues of concerns to many minority groups. Quickly, is there any common thread as to what these groups are interested in?
There is a common thread, Belva, and this morning what we released was the latest set of data from the field poll. Not only does it look at the whole range of California voters, but also breaks out into specific ethnic voting groups. And you know, this is a series of multilingual polls, 6 languages, of course includes white, non-Hispanic, Latino, African American, but also several Asian groups, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean. And what the field poll was able to track from the beginning of the year through mid-September is what many have discussed, that during the last 22 years, the California registration voter rolls, we now know that there's 18 million of them going to come out and vote. There has been an increase of 4 million, and over 90% of that comes from the state's ethnic voter population. Just looking at 2 groups alone, their shares almost doubled. Latinos from 10% 22 years ago, now at about 24. Asians from 3% now to about 8. California became a blue state in the last 20 years because of the ethnic voting population. And if I were to quote Field Poll Executive Director Mark DeCamillo, he says, it's demography marching on.
And we do know, I mean, Latino vote you're talking about, Odette, in 2 swing states, Nevada and Colorado, is going to be the key. I've been to those states that early, the get out the vote among the Latino grassroots activists there is huge. And that could give President Obama the margin
other
there.
group, women, gender.
Women, you know, we had this week Sandra Fluke here in the Bay Area, the reproductive rights activist. Look, women have been for Obama. He's enjoyed this gender gap for a long time, and in the last couple of weeks, Romney has managed to shave that down. That's very concerning to these reproductive rights groups, and they've been really working this vote all over the country. And the fact is that they've tracked what they say is about 5 million women who they call Obama defectors, who may go to the other side, go to Mitt Romney, and that could be a key margin in some of these swing states,
Carla,
particularly Florida and Ohio.
That almost floored me looking at that particular headline. You wrote Obama women defectors, and I'm wondering the major reasons why. Just anecdotally, you talk to a lot of women, including minority women. Some of them have gone to their pharmacies in the last 2 weeks for the very first time, are getting their birth control pills for free. And a lot of them have expressed the fact that if this was any kind of an endorsement for any president, it would be this.
Yeah,
those $15
very good point.
per month.
Why has that margin collapsed? In some people say because Romney has been very successful, sort of at least tempering his opposition to Roe v. Wade, and he's got ads out there that suggest he's not going to be an activist on that issue. You're right about the issue of Obamacare. For a lot of women, birth control is an economic issue, and that's one of the things Democrats have brought out in the last couple of weeks, too.
John, we have been asked you on the issues question. With all of the money being spent in and around you for all of those seats, is there any issue? You just said it was mostly about money, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think it's a reflection of the national campaigns on those congressional races. I mean, I do think that we're having this national discussion about health care. We're having a national discussion about budget priorities. I mean, obviously, you've got a Congress and a president, whoever that president is, facing this fiscal cliff, as they're talking about in Washington. So I think you're hearing that a lot on the congressional level. But I want to roll back, if I can, to the state ballot measures, because I do think that, you know, the most fascinating dynamic to me out of this ballot measure campaign has been Jerry Brown's continual lobbying about not so much what's great about his tax initiative, Prop 30, but what's bad if it fails. We've seen in polling, and you talk to people, that there is this real angst about these trigger cuts, these automatic spending cuts that were baked into the state budget, $6 billion worth, mostly to education, should Prop 30 fail. You look at the polling, that is a very potent issue, and Brown clearly knew that and seems to be campaigning on it. But at the same time, Jerry Brown's kind of been his own worst enemy, I think, when he's been talking about the issues of why you want to have this tax increase. It's a temporary tax increase. He'll go out on the stump and say it's about the budget. He'll say it's about jobs, even though his ads say it's about schools. I think that has been a very fascinating dynamic here, is that, you know, Californians sense there are a lot of things wrong. There are a lot of things they want to fix. Does the tax fix it? Does Jerry Brown have the ideas to fix it? Do the legislators, are they going to get elected on Tuesday? Do they have the ideas and the gumption to fix it?
And John,
yeah.
I think you've raised an issue that also works in the presidential race, and that is one of the things that voters are looking at is the role of government. Whether you talk about education funding, infrastructure funding, or on a national level, look at the reaction to Hurricane Sandy and the questions being posed to Mitt Romney about FEMA funding.
Did President Obama get a bump in ratings out of
I think
handling of Sandy?
Look, in this last week, we've seen a sort of a sea change in the presidential race. Obama not only got a bump in the polls, no doubt about it, but the fact he got the support of Michael Bloomberg and Chris Christie.
Well, Chris Christie hasn't endorsed
Hasn't
him.
endorsed him. But the fact is, he said he endorsed his role,
his leadership,
right. And I think that was very critical. It did raise the whole issue of what is the role of government, and I think a lot of people stood back and watched some of the destruction there. I think the effects of Sandy are going to be talked about for a long time on this presidential race, coming where they did when Romney has had some momentum going into it. We'll see if he does coming out of it.
I have to return to Odette here.
Yeah.
I asked you about issues. We talked about polls.
Yes.
Were there issues that these groups or any of the groups?
A lot of what we were
concerned
also able to do, Belva, looking beyond the numbers, was to also glean direct insights from ethnic media journalists in a weekly election series that we did. And it was really these pulse points that were really critical. You have Latino voters, as I mentioned, having that frustration, feeling that that crux of what democracy and what politics meant to them was being taken away. Some significant shifts that we saw with Filipinos. Not the field poll, but an NAAS survey, National Asian American Survey, was released also recently, and it showed for the first time a really significant shift. Close to 40% of Filipinos among likely Asian voters now either directly identifying with or leaning towards Governor Romney and the GOP ticket. And I spoke with a high-ranking GOP grassroots Filipino leader. What is this about? And he said, I can sum it up for one word for you, Odette. It's the economy. Filipino Republicans, or maybe even Filipinos who have been Democrats in the past or have not supported the GOP, are now taking a second look because they've been hurt in the 4 years. But Filipino Democrats are also arguing it's intergenerational.
But let's talk about another group that we don't hear anything about their concerns. Jobs for African American, particularly African American males, poverty rate going up. Nothing from those groups in terms of complaint?
The unemployment numbers with African Americans group definitely being reported about widely, the highest since the Great Depression. What our African American Media Monitor based in Washington, D.C. was able to glean from newspapers like the Washington Afro, the range of black media, you can see from the endorsements, you can see from the kind of reporting they're doing, there is more of an openness in the African American community to recognize that President Obama inherited 2 wars and a crumbling economy, and that they are willing they recognize that 4 years was not enough of a timetable, and they're willing to let him attempt to turn this around.
How much will voter suppression play into this in terms of firing up the African American
That's an
vote?
interesting point, because specifically with the African American community, we just saw in Florida, one polling precinct, about 1,000 votes through some computer glitch that could barely be explained. Voting suppression was a key issue in terms of some African American voters who had not considered President Obama, may have not supported him, being ticked off, being really pissed, and looking at this as a Republican tactic to suppress their votes, and now they're going to say, we're full sail with President Obama.
Okay, as we wrap this up, have any of you seen an election like this one in your years of working?
No, never.
This
one's one for the books.
Not at all.
One for the books.
Well, the dynamics are just so unusual. I mean, how many times do you have this many storylines coming together with the economy, with jobs, with a contentious race, with a divided electorate, and with really no actual agreement on what to do? I think even inside political constituency groups, people bicker all the time about what's the appropriate course. So no, I haven't seen that at all.
Well, that is why the next story is going to move into view, because we've had so much bickering over so many weeks and no agreement over most of anything. So here's something we can all pretty much agree on if you live here.
Belva said that.
History is in the making this week as the San Francisco Giants celebrated their sweep of the Detroit Tigers in the World Series, the second championship win for the team in 3 years. Wednesday, a huge sea of orange and black filled Civic Center Plaza.
Congratulations on sweeping leadership.
Mayor Ed Lee presented the team with a golden broom and a key to the city. VIPs lined the stage, but the biggest applause came for the players. Pitcher Ryan Vogelson said they couldn't have won without the support of the fans.
Brought it for us in the postseason. We went to Cincinnati, they weren't as loud as you. We went to St. Louis, they weren't as loud as you. And quite frankly, Detroit's fans weren't even close to as loud as you. And that's why we won. Thank you very much.
Well, as a woman who spent most of her time thinking and worrying about politics, I got to tell you, it was so good to put on this orange and black and just be happy.
Sounds great.
So be sure to tune in on Tuesday evening, though, as we make history with our very first ever live election special. Field poll director Mark DiCamillo, political consultant Randy Shandeville, News Hours Spencer Michaels, and KQED's on Scott Schaefer will offer insight and analysis on local and statewide election returns, directly following the PBS News Hours national coverage, whenever that is. Well, my thanks to all of you, the guests at the table, and to all of you for watching. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.